Today's teaching is on the second chapter titled The History of Indian Buddhism, and it begins on page 39. And His Eminence Taisitu Rinpoche begins by saying the Buddha was born 2,500 years ago. And while that might seem like a very, very long time ago for us, perhaps ancient history, in terms of the age of the universe, it's actually a very short period of time. And so it's interesting to have this perspective. Instead of it being a long, long time ago, that actually it's a very short time ago that the Buddha was alive and taught, and so forth. So, as we all know, the origin of Buddhism came from the Buddha, who was born in what is now a very southern part of Nepal, but at that time was part of India. And again, at that time, India was a loose collection of different states, but did have this central organization as a country. But countries then are very different than what we look at as countries today. And very soon after the Buddha's parinirvana, that it started to spread to other parts of India and other parts of Asia. And as it spread, it changed and took on, you might say, the flavor of the countries that it was being adopted by or adapted to these the cultures of these countries. And this is not a problem because the Buddha taught about ultimate reality and he taught about relative reality. And these different forms of Buddhism have developed due to the aptitude, you might say, cultural background, what individuals bring to Buddhism on the relative level. And therefore, since there's a wide variety of differences among human beings, both in terms of psychology and culture, it's only natural that Buddhism would, while becoming unchanged at the ultimate level, would change at the relative level to meet the needs of specific individuals in specific countries. He said there isn't much in the Tibetan texts about the history of Buddhism, about it being in other countries, other than in China. But all of these different forms of Buddhism he considered valid. And of course, when you take refuge, one of the underlying, you might say, rules that you are encouraged to follow is to not denigrate other lineages in Buddhism in other countries, and actually of all religions in general. So he then goes into talking about the three turnings of the wheel, which are three separate teachings that the Buddha gave. And this is referred to frequently in, among other things, 7-branch prayers, where one of the branches is to request that the Buddha turns the wheel of Dharma. which is another way of saying requesting that the Buddha teach. And so he divides up these three turnings of the wheel into the first one being at Varanasi, where he taught the Four Noble Truths. This was really the first teaching the Buddha gave. And very simply, it is the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, the truth of the path to, in his words, become free of suffering. And the last one, this is how he defines it, and he spoke in English, the truth of peace, the state free of suffering. Sometimes it is called the nirvana or the cessation of suffering. But he, again, speaking in English, his own words are the truth of peace / the state free of suffering. Now, the next, or the second turning of the wheel of Dharma was at Rajgir, Rajgir. And here he taught about bodhicitta and about emptiness. It is here that the Heart Sutra was given. And so he talks about these teachings discussing our true potential and the true potential of everything. Also taught about our shortcomings. And because these are obstacles to us realizing our true potential. So we have to recognize what our shortcomings are, where our blockages are, what needs to be worked with, and so forth. So then he goes into talking a little bit about emptiness, because this is perhaps one of the most difficult topics to talk about, and also one of the most easily misunderstood. So very simply, emptiness is not about voidness or nothingness. As he says, if it was, we wouldn't have to need to do anything. That if there was no such thing as karma, future lives, and so on and so forth, if it was all just plain void and nothing, then, well, just eat, drink, and be merry. Wine, women, and song, drugs, sex, and rock and roll, and so forth. That what emptiness is really about is interdependence, that things depend on other things for them to arise and to continue to exist. So on page 40, he has this quote: "This emptiness means that everything is only relatively true. Ultimately, everything is nothing more and nothing less than an interdependent manifestation of everything else." And he goes into explaining this. He starts out by talking about that in order for us to see, we need to have light. If there were not light, our eyes would be useless and we would not have developed them in our bodies. So in order for us to see, we need our eyes, we need light, and then the light has to reflect off of an object. For sound, we need to have motion, because it is the vibrations that we pick up with our ears, the vibration of things moving, whether it be our vocal cords or chalk screeching against a blackboard. So that this is what is meant by emptiness, that things arise because of causes and conditions, that there is nothing that arises in samsara that is able to bring itself into existence. The third turning of the wheel comprises of most of the teachings of the Buddha. These were given all over India, and they're not limited to one particular topic like the other two turnings of the wheel, and they cover all aspects of Dharma. There are some that would be considered the foundation path, some that would be considered Mahayana, and some that would be considered Tantrayana. After the Buddha's parinirvana, there were a few meetings or councils of his disciples that met, and they divided the teachings up slightly differently. They divided them into Vinaya, Abhidharma, Sutra, and then Tantra. So he explains this now in detail, even if it is briefly. So in Vinaya, there are vows that you take, and they are body, speech, and mind. They are discipline of body and speech. So this is primarily external discipline, as the mind is not included in these rules. And this includes both monastic rules and discipline, as well as lay vows and lay discipline. People that are not wearing the robes, that have not taken monastic vows, and so forth. The Abhidharma contains psychology and cosmology and mathematics. And so I thought it would be good to briefly discuss what cosmology is, so that we had a better idea of what it means here in this case. So cosmology is a branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of the universe. An alternative definition is a theory or doctrine describing the natural order of the universe. So in Sutra, unlike the Vinaya, the Buddha talked about mental discipline. And in Vajrayana, and this is the specialty of Tibetan Buddhism. If you are a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, then you are almost by definition a Vajrayana practitioner. So it is taught, and Taisitu Rinpoche mentions this, that when the Buddha was enlightened and then taught, that his form was a physical body and it was surrounded by 2 meters of light. He had the 32 major marks but he felt they were not as prominent as they would be depicted now in paintings and sculptures. So this is an important point. So for the first three types of teachings, he taught in his ordinary form as a human being. And then for the last one, for teaching Tantra and so forth, he actually appeared in the body of a deity in consort with a second deity. And Taisita Rinpoche says this, that, quote, this dualism, samsara, started in every moment, end quote. This is on page 44. And the reason he brings this up is that Tantra, when the Buddha did teach it, he appeared in his Sambhogakaya form. And he only taught to a few very highly realized beings. It was not widely given, these talks on Tantra. So this is something for us to think about too. That when we come in contact with Tantra, we have to be careful, and we really have to, you might say, look within and see if we are ready to practice these Tantras that initiations or abhishekas are frequently given. This idea about dualism starting in every moment, to go back to it, is basically saying that we create samsara. And as long as we create it, it will continue. It's not created by the Buddha or another enlightened being. It is that we have created ourselves. He then talks a little bit about time in terms of the relative and the ultimate. And this is a very interesting discussion, that time is relative. So when you attain enlightenment, it will appear both that samsara lasted for you nothing more than an instant, and it will also appear like it has gone on forever since the beginningless beginning. And in his discussion then about time, he first of all begins with an ant, like that ants just work, 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 and they do not rest much of the time. And that to a human, their viewpoint of time must seem the time goes very quickly and time is short. They, of course, don't live nearly as long on average as a human being. So there are lots of things about an ant that would cause them to perceive things like time very differently to a human being. And in fact, this, when I was reading that, reminded me of a joke, and so I can't resist telling it. And it's about the man that lived out in the country, and he had a pet pig. And in the fall, when his apple trees were full of fruit, but the fruit hadn't fallen yet, he loved that pig so much that he would pick up the pig. This was a young pig, of course, hold it in his arms and bring it up towards the apples in the tree and let the pig eat. And his neighbors saw him doing that one time. And so the next time the neighbor saw the man with the pig, he said to him, why are you doing that? And the neighbor, because he was scratching his head, and the neighbor said, well, the pig, this is one of his favorite fruits. He just loves it when I do this. And so the man said, well, doesn't this take a lot of time? And the owner of the pig said, what's time to a pig? So time is very much a matter of how we perceive it. If you've ever had a child and gone on let's say a road trip with the child, and you have told the child that this road trip is going to take days, maybe you're going to visit grandma, or at least all day long. 15 minutes after you leave home, a young child will almost inevitably say, are we there yet? So a child will have a different perception of time than an adult. And of course, adults can also have very different perceptions of time. Some people feel that the days just go on forever, and others feel that the day is much too short, that they're not getting what they wanted to accomplish done in a day. So this is the idea of relative versus the ultimate. And to take this back to the teachings of the Buddha, then I mentioned that this first teaching was of the Four Noble Truths. And then the second one was about emptiness and bodhicitta. And the third one was actually about psychology and cosmology and math. Cosmology, I had to look that up to make sure I understood it, and so that you would understand it too. And according to the dictionary, cosmology is a branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature of the universe. And an alternate definition is a theory or doctrine describing the natural order of the universe. So this is the Abhidharma. And what happened was that these three turning of the wheel of teachings was then later divided up by councils that met a number of times after the Buddha's parinirvana, and divided up the teachings into four parts. And they were the Vinaya, which is about discipline of body and speech, external discipline, Abhidharma, which I just mentioned, the sutras. And the sutras are about mental discipline. And he talks at great length about the meaning, the difference in meanings of sutra in Buddhism versus in the popular And frequently Buddhists take the popular meaning of the sutra rather than the actual meaning of the sutra. The sutras talk about bodhicitta, compassion, loving kindness, and the 6 transcendent virtues. There are many, many different sutras out there, and some of them have been translated into English, many of them have not. When the Buddha taught sutras, he taught in the form of his physical body that he was born with and grew up with. When he taught Tantra, he actually manifested as a Sambhogakaya deity that was associated with the Tantra that he was talking about. And this Sambhogakaya form included the entire mandala of that deity. So he only taught Tantra to the highest, most evolved beings. So most of the students of the Buddha never even heard about Tantra at the time of the Buddha's life. So these are the 4, you might say, divisions that are used in Tibetan Buddhism of the teachings of the Buddha. The Vinaya, which is about external discipline of the body and our speech. And this includes lay vows, monastic vows, refuge vows, and so forth. And then you have in the sutras talking about mental discipline and talking about bodhicitta, compassion, loving kindness, and so forth. You have the bodhisattva vows that you can take. And then the Abhidharma is about Buddhist psychology and cosmology. And it's interesting that these, you might say, Buddhist practitioners and great writers, that they actually came up through their own experience as having a high level of realization, plus their logical reasoning, came up with the, I don't know if the word is a theory, an idea, or what, but that since the material world is composite, made out of parts, and this comes into the idea of emptiness and interdependence. And that by breaking down the parts into smaller and smaller parts and smaller and smaller parts, they came up with the idea of what is translated. I don't know what the original Sanskrit word is, but what is translated into English as an atom. And what this smallest particle had to be is a particle that had no top or bottom or sides. In other words, it had no parts. And so this cosmology included very precise analysis of the world that we live in, as well as the universe at large. And in terms of the universe at large, it was that this universe is just merely one of perhaps other universes that are existing at the same time, and that that universes come and go, and that there have been previous universes before this one, and there will be future universes. after this one as long as there are confused sentient beings. So again, he talks and goes to great length at how sutra is misunderstood and frequently used to mean any teaching of the Buddhist or any Buddhist teaching, actually. And to go into the Tantra that the Buddha taught, he said it was taught to primarily the very highest students, and its intention was to help purify dualistic thinking. And so Taisitu Rinpoche goes into a little bit about dualism. And he is talking here about beings that would practice Tantra have already conquered their afflictive states of mind. But it is this fundamental ignorance of taking that which is not a self to be a self, and that which is not an other to be an other. That this fundamental ignorance is the actual basis of samsara. And so he said, if you look and look and look for a self, or for your ego, your confused ego, you will find nothing. No matter how hard you look, you will never find anything. Even the Buddha could not find anything. And then, of course, a very interesting question that comes from that, when you look and you can't find anything, then the question is, well, who is looking? So even doing that has this dualistic aspect to it. He says that, quote, dualism starts in every moment that we create it. And as long as we create it, it will continue. And that's why I was talking a little bit about his teaching on time, that time is extremely relative. On the other hand, for an enlightened being, they will see that this samsara, which is beginningless and possibly endless, that it actually is only an instant, because an enlightened being would be beyond time. To go into Tantra again, that the more advanced Tantras have deities that are both male and female in union. And this too can be misunderstood, and frequently is misunderstood. What this means is it's not about sex. It is about the union of wisdom, specifically emptiness, and means. The female deity represents emptiness, and the male deity represents method or skill with means. Also, with the higher tantras, to help remove duality, there is not this distinction between clean and dirty, beautiful, ugly, and so forth. And this helps overcome that kind of dualistic thinking. He says this, now today we practice Tantra. Technically, the Chenrezig practice that we do is Tantra. And so we are a long ways from being the very highest of the students of Buddha, who all we have to do now is remove dualistic thinking, that we have plenty of habitual patterns and karma that need to be purified. We have plenty of afflictive states of mind that need to be purified and so forth. But he says that nowadays we practice Tantra as a means of accomplishing the goals of the A, Vinaya, B, Abhidharma, C, Sutra, as well as Tantra. So our motivation is to practice the Dharma, to practice Tantra, so that we can travel the path and be of most benefit to beings, so that we can liberate all sentient beings. He mentions that the Tantra that he follows, he keeps his Vinaya and Bodhisattva vows, that they do not contradict each other. And he kind of finishes up this section by mentioning that in soks, which is a Tibetan word, which means feast, in many of them, alcohol is used, and everybody takes just a little bit. And he said this isn't a problem for him, even though he has vows against drinking intoxicants, that with these soaks, it is interpreted as being fine to do this, but it's only a very, very small amount. He mentions that in some monasteries and centers that they do not give out any alcohol, that they give, I believe he used the term orange juice. And at KTD, I have seen it both ways, not at the same one. But I think maybe you can even choose. The Karmapa, I believe, has said that it is fine to use the alcohol. Needless to say, if you're an alcoholic, you want to not drink it if it's going to cause an increased desire to have alcohol. Now he then goes into tantric images. And these are widely disseminated, and really many people who have little or no contact with Buddhism are at least familiar with some of them. And he says it really hasn't been until the last 100 years that they've been widely shared and shown publicly. That it used to be empowerments were given to a very small number of students privately. And of course, this has all changed. Now they are given publicly, advertised publicly, and so forth. You do have to have taken refuge to attend an empowerment. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche frequently would give refuge just before an empowerment. So if there was somebody there that wanted the empowerment that didn't have refuge, they could take care of it right there on the spot and then receive the empowerment. In fact, that was the case with me. I took refuge with Rinpoche in the morning, and then in the late afternoon, there was a Marpa empowerment. But he says that he feels they are given too frequently. And the 17th Karmapa also feels the same way. Although the 17th Karmapa, when he does travel, he still gives plenty of empowerment. So to go on here, one of the problems is these pictures can be misunderstood, especially the ones where you have a male and female deity in union standing or sitting together. And there is sexual tantra too, which he mentioned very briefly. Khenpo Rinpoche said this, there's nobody, he was asked this question when we were in 3-year retreat. He said, there's nobody here that's on the level high enough for them to do this. So it really requires a very, very high level of realization to practice sexual tantra. He also says that there are always people who will misuse Tantra to, quote, show their power, attract, or use people. So this is a problem, and it's a real serious problem for the person that does that, because it has huge negative karmic consequences for a person that would misuse Tantra for their own egotistical aims. So next he talks about the different classes of Tantra, and I'm just going to go over them extremely briefly. But there's a lot packed into this chapter that helps to have some background information as you're practicing, helps you understand things a little bit better. So the first is Kriya, K-R-I-Y-A. And this stresses external discipline, vegetarianism, cleanliness of yourself, your clothes, of the shrine room, and so forth. At the other end is the Anuttara Yoga Tantra, which is the highest level, and that which is trying to, of course, remove dualistic thinking. All of this discipline, external discipline, is totally irrelevant. Now, the Nyungne, which has fasting in it, stresses cleanliness, and so forth, it has this element of Tantra in it, but it has other elements of other Tantras in it too. It's an interesting practice. Then the next one above that is Charya, Charya. Then above that is Yoga Tantra, and then Anuttara Yoga. And that Anuttara Yoga is divided up into 3 levels further, Maha, Anu, and Ati. And it is Ati that is very similar to Dzogchen in the Nyingma tradition. So he finishes up this section by saying that the 16th Karmapa, who was the Taisitu Rinpoche was very close to, was very strict about ethics when practicing Tantra. and strongly encourage people to keep their Vinaya discipline and Bodhisattva vows. And the 17th Karmapa is the same way, and Taisitu Rinpoche is the same way. So next we have a classification of the teachings of the Buddha and the commentaries about the teachings of the Buddha. So the teachings of the Buddha have been translated into Tibetan, and this body of works is called the Tenjur, Tenjur. And these teachings, Kanjur, Kanjur. I got ahead of myself here. These are the actual words of the Buddha. They were memorized originally and then later written down. There are 100 texts in Tibetan. Taisitu Rinpoche says if they were translated in English, it would be between 300 and 400 texts. And then there is the Tenjur, which are the teachings of the great masters. And that there are 220 of these texts in Tibetan. And he says there would be 2 to 4 times more if translated, all of them translated into English, which would be 440 to 880 different books. And he says there are 2 qualities that have to be met for these teachings to be included in the Tenjur. The first one is practicing in accordance with that particular teaching must purify the defilements. And secondly, liberate beings, especially from the lower realms and also from samsara in general. And so he mentions the names of 8 great masters that their texts are in this body of commentaries. Some of them you will recognize: Nagarjuna, Arya Deva, Asanga, Vasubandhu, Digna, Dharmakirti, Gurna Prabha, Shakya Prabha. He then mentions 84 taras, and the tara is a small t. And I really don't know anything about this. So I'm just passing it on, but not going to comment any on it. And then he says there are also over 30 enlightened women, Mahasiddhas. There are 5 teachings from Maitreya that were given to a Sangha when Maitreya appeared to a Sangha. Next, he talks about how Buddhism was brought and spread in Tibet. This finishes up the main part of the text. Does not include the question and answers, but it begins with the king Trisun Detsun, who was a Buddhist, and he wanted to firmly plant Buddhism in Tibet. And so he brought in Guru Rinpoche. And this happened in the second half of the 8th century of our current era. Shantarakshita became the abbot of the first monastery, which was built under the direction of Drisun Detsun and with the help of Guru Rinpoche. And this is where Shantarakshita was the abbot. He also was a translator. And this is the source of the Nyingma lineage. The Nyingma lineage is by far the oldest lineage in Tibetan Buddhism, and frequently it is called the Old Translation School. and everything that came after that new translation. So along with that lineage, then you have Atisha, who came and brought the teachings on the mind training, which later became the 7 points of mind training and the Lojong slogans. And the teachings that he brought then became incorporated into a lineage that was referred to as the Kadampa lineage. And that morphed into the Galupa lineage, although elements of the Kadampa lineage were brought into the Kagyu lineage and the other lineages as well, the Nyingma and the Sakya. So that brings up the Sakya lineage. And this lineage got their name because their first monastery was located in an area of Tibet which had no trees and little vegetation. Actually, much of Tibet would be considered an alpine desert. And so this area was one like that. And because of the lack of vegetation, the ground was very visible and it was pale. And that's actually what Sakya means. It means pale earth. Marpa then, he founded the Kagyu lineage by traveling to India 3 times in his lifetime and bringing back teachings. And then there is the Shangpa Kagyu. And they were brought to Tibet and came from Niguma, who is associated with Naropa. And some sources say that she was a consort of Naropa. Others say related to Naropa, but also then Sukha city. So this lineage came from Indian female Mahasiddhis. And this lineage is held by Taisitus. And Taisitu is considered a incarnation going back to Marpa. There were some other lineages here that I mentioned. One is the Chu lineage, and came from Padapa Sanjay and Machik Lobdran, or Drolma. And that is a practice of visualizing yourself, feeding yourself to beings, making offerings to them with your body. Then there is the Jonangapa lineage that's based on the Kalachakra teachings. And these last 2 that I mentioned, those have been, the Cho has been incorporated into the Kagyu. That was taught in the 3-year retreat that I did. And I know Lama Soltram, who is the male Drupan out at Karmeling. He has taught Chu at KTD and weekend programs. And then the last one is it's called Sa Lung. And this has to do with yoga that is involved with the channels of the body and the subtle energy of the body. So he finishes this section up by saying that today there are 5 functional lineages: the Nyingma, the Kagyu, the Galupa, the Sakya, and then his lineage, the Shangpa. Very quickly here, I want to go over the question and answer session because there's a huge amount of information here that is useful. So very briefly, the first point he makes is that there seems to be some similarity with the Zen teachings and the Mahamudra teachings of the Kagyu lineage. Later on, he was asked about Dzogchen and Mahamudra, and he said they seem to be very similar. Then he is asked about the Kagyu path of practice. And this is the way Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche had his students travel the path. First, you take refuge, and then you do basic practices like Chenrezi, Amitabha, and so forth. Then there is the contemplation of the four ordinary foundations, and that is precious human birth, impermanence, karma, you might say the infallible law of karma, and then the unsatisfactory state of all the different realms in samsara. Then after doing that contemplation for a while, doing Nundro. And he said that at this point, some people would enter 3-year retreat. Rinpoche has, as a requirement, you finish Nundro before you would start a 3-year retreat at Karme Ling. But then after completing Nundro, you then could do other practices, and he mentioned specifically doing 108 Nyungne. And I'm looking forward to when things open up, starting to hold more Nyungne here at the Hay River KTC. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche would have another practice when you finish Nundro Karma Pakshi, and you would do that. Then, if your Lama, your Guru, this would have to be a high Lama, not me, but if your high Lama felt that you were ready for a more advanced practice, the progression would be do Vajrayogini. And this probably would be at least part of it, if not all of it, in a solitary retreat, because it's a very complicated practice. It takes time to do it, and you would need a lot of personal instructions to do it. Then after completing that, do Chakra Samvara, and the same thing holds for Chakra Samvara as it does for Vajrayogini. It's a very difficult, complicated tantra. Then after that, the 6 yogas of Naropa. And this also, you would be doing Mahakala, Mahakali during these practices for protection. They are Dharma protectors. Then he said, after that, if the Lama deems you ready, you would receive the transmission on the nature of mind. He said that the common people in Tibet would do 100 million manis using prayer wheels, and that many of them would repeat this over and over and over again. The idea of chanting in Tibetan comes up. And basically, he says that Tibetan is more effective than the English if you have received the, he says the transmission, but what he's talking about here is both an empowerment, if the practice has one, and definitely the reading transmission. He then talks about the Vajrasattva mantra and saying that it's very effective practice for purification. He was asked about a practice being very powerful or more powerful, and his answer, I think, is beautiful. Quote, "The most powerful practice is the one done totally, when your body, speech, and mind, motivation, intention, everything is concentrated 100% with faith, devotion, and compassion." He was asked about studying the sutras, and he says, "We study sutras to be able to practice." The Kagyus are called the practice lineage, by the way. He says, if you know your practice, you don't need to study unless you want to teach. And then he mentions a professor, a university professor in Delhi that is teaching Havajra. And he says, well, since there's no transmission involved here, that he's really not teaching Havajra, and that his students are mere students and they are not disciples. And so this is a very important distinction to make, and that is the difference between a university teacher or any kind of educational teacher, and the difference between them and a lama. That the lama, if they're teaching properly, will have an unbroken lineage behind the teachings that they are given. And that's what they're giving, and that's what makes these teaching more effective. And he mentions that he learned mantras the way the Tibetans mispronounce them, and that if he would pronounce them according to proper Sanskrit, that they would lose their effectiveness, because this is the sound of these mantras when he received the transmission for them. And then finally, he's asked about the differences between Hindu and Buddhist tantras. And he says, I can't answer that because I haven't studied and practiced the Hindu tantra. And he said, if you would ask a Hindu tantra master, he would probably give you the same answer about not being able to say much about Tibetan Buddhist tantra.